بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. Well, to start with, it's a different experience from the one I had at King's College in London. You are not in a prison here. Because when I went to speak to the students there, I wasn't allowed in, so I had to speak to them from behind the gate. And the students were on the inside as if they were prisoners. But this is actually symbolic of the sort of world order we live in. A world order that is so oppressive, so racist, and has no consideration whatsoever for the basic human rights of the majority of humans. But let me go back to what I was asked to speak about, and that's my experience as a Palestinian. I was born in 1955. When I was born, the city I was born in, which is Al-Khalil or Hebron in the West Bank, was part of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, no longer part of Palestine, because 7 years earlier, 7 years before I was born, the Nakba had occurred when the Zionist entity was established in my homeland, and 2/3 of Palestine was occupied at that moment by the Zionists, and the remaining territories, remaining third, the West Bank and Gaza, had to be assigned according to whatever order that existed at the time. So the West Bank was placed under the newly born Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Actually, Jordan was always a river throughout history. And then suddenly the British create a state called Jordan. And Gaza was placed under the military rule of the Egyptians. Not part of Egypt, but as if occupied by the Egyptians instead of occupied by the Zionists. Now, at the age of about 8, I left my hometown, joined my family. My parents went to Kuwait, like many Palestinians did. They'd travel to the Gulf to be able to earn a living and sustain themselves. And when we were in Kuwait in 1967, just 4 years after arriving in Kuwait, my hometown was also occupied by the Zionists. That happened in 1967 with the so-called Six-Day War, when the Zionists took the rest of Palestine. That is the whole of the West Bank and the whole of Gaza, in addition to Sinai, which is even much larger than Palestine, several times the size of Palestine, and the Golan Heights, which were part of Syria until 1967. Like every Palestinian, see, there is nothing really unique about my story. If you speak to any Palestinian, our stories are very similar. The center of our life is our desire and struggle to return home. And this is because our parents kept telling us about what happened to our country. So any Palestinian family is highly politicized. Palestinian children from young age, they know the history of what happened to their people and to their country. And they'd be involved in activism. I became involved in activism at a very young age. I remember when I was at about 13 years old, in 1968, I heard the news of the guerrilla fighters, or the Fidaiyin as we call them, assembling in Jordan and launching operations to liberate Palestine from Jordan. That was a very brief period of time, from 1968 to 1970, when they were then removed. But in 1968, at the age of 13, I remember I wrote a letter to my father. I dreaded speaking directly to my father. So I wrote a letter and went to school. And I said to him that we have no honor without our free country. And I wish to go and join the Fidaiyin the guerrilla fighters in Jordan. And of course, my father received the letter with mixed feelings. There's sorrow on one hand and happiness on the other. He was sorry because this reminded him of this deep wound that every one of us is born into. He himself, my father, was a resistance fighter in 1948. Regrettably, the balance of power was not in their favor, so they lost to the Zionists. But he was also happy that this 13 years old child has grown up to be attached to Palestine to the extent that he feels it's his duty to leave school and leave life and just go and join the resistance fighters in Jordan. I remember from then on, I was always an active pupil and then student. Kuwait, in particular, among all the Arab countries of the time, provided a bigger margin of freedom for activism. So that was really lucky for us. If you read about the history of Palestine, and I explain this in my book, Hamas, the Unwritten Chapters, that Fatah was created in Kuwait, and then Hamas was created in Kuwait. Or I should say that the seeds for Fatah were planted in Kuwait, as the seeds of Hamas were also planted in Kuwait. So Kuwait provided the Palestinians who, until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, were the biggest or the largest non-Kuwaiti minority, the largest Arab minority, or any minority of any sort. They numbered about 500,000 in Kuwait. So Kuwait provided that sort of milieu. 1974, I finished high school and came to this country to study. And here, I joined the Muslim Student Society, which used to be the platform of activism for Muslim students coming from the Arab world, and have since been active. And it's just part of your life as a Palestinian. You live for nothing else apart from this hope that one day Palestine will again be free, and you'll be able to return to it. And if you are a Muslim, and if you are a committed Muslim, then you add to this the religious obligation you derive from your faith, that this is a Muslim country invaded and occupied by foreigners in order to undermine the Ummah as a whole, using this just as a spearhead, really. And that's why it's very important. I'm sure probably on average the brothers and the sisters here are well educated about Palestine, but it's very important to educate ourselves about the history of this problem. Until the 7th of October, and what the 7th of October caused in the world of tremor, few people were interested in knowing why we have a problem in Palestine. I regret to say that even many Muslims were not so keen on, yes, we sympathize as Muslims, we have feelings for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, but to what extent are we prepared to sit down and learn properly the history of this problem? That this problem did not start really in what is known as the Middle East. It started somewhere else. The whole issue of Zionism has nothing to do with the region. Zionism, as an ideology, as a phenomenon, was the product of a European experience. And that's why anti-Semitism is also European. So both Zionism and anti-Semitism are European. Europeans, Christian Europeans, always had a problem with the Jews. They hated the Jews. Unlike the sentiments that the Muslims and the Arabs had elsewhere. Jews lived in Muslim lands for centuries. Iraq had the oldest Jewish community in the world. There were ancient Jews in Yemen, in Morocco, and elsewhere. If you went to Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, everywhere, Turkey, they were Jews. When Jews were persecuted elsewhere, as happened to them in Spain when the Muslims were kicked out, they came to the Muslim lands. Because to Muslims, Jews are what? Are the people of the book. Ahlul Dhimma. They have a covenant of protection and respect that we Muslims are obliged to observe. So we didn't have this anti-Semitism. Any talk about Muslim or Arab anti-Semitism is nonsense. Because anti-Semitism is something that is uniquely European. It's to do with how the Christians of Europe perceived the Jews for very long. Until Russia saw the pogroms, followed by the Dreyfus affair in France, followed by the Holocaust. These were all manifestations of the inability of Christian Europe to accommodate the Jews of Europe. The pogroms in Russia, in particular, in the late 19th century, drove some secular Jews in Europe, in Western Europe, or on the borders of Western and Eastern Europe, to think of an alternative to this situation. We cannot continue to be treated this way. Because if you were Jewish in Europe at the time, and you had ambitions, most likely you had to convert to Christianity, to baptize, to be accepted. And this is what, for instance, the father of Marx did. You know, Marx, the founder of communism, his father converted to Christianity. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Jewish Zionism, what they refer to as political Zionism, actually was on his way to convert to Christianity when he heard the news of the pogroms in Russia. So he met with some other fellow secular Jews, and they came to the conclusion that why can't we Jews have a country of our own? So you see, the persecution of the Jews, the unfair treatment of the Jews of Europe, the hatred of the Jews, which became known as anti-Semitism, is what prompted these young men to think of having a homeland somewhere in the world. And it wasn't necessarily Palestine. Actually, Theodor Herzl thought that Palestine wasn't the best place for a Jewish homeland. Probably Argentina was much better, far away from trouble, where you had lots of natural resources. You could provide a sustainable country in Argentina. When that wasn't convincing to the Russian Jews, he thought of Cyprus. He even thought of Libya. Libya was under Italian colonialism, and he went to see the king of Italy and beg him to give them Libya. He thought of Eastern Africa. But eventually, the decision to allocate Palestine to be the homeland for the Jews who were persecuted in Europe was a decision by the world order of the time. A world order that was led by the likes of Balfour, who was actually a Christian Zionist. And it's important here to notice that Christian Zionism preceded Jewish Zionism by centuries. Christian Zionism goes all the way to the founding of Protestantism, to Martin Luther and to Calvin in particular, who believed that the Messiah needed the return of the Jews to the homeland in order to pave his coming. So there was a religious motivation. But there was another, no less important motivation, purely political one, and that is the defeat of the Ottomans in the First World War. The defeat of the Ottomans left a vast territory of land divided between the victors, the British and the French, who decided that a world order similar to that represented by the Ottomans should never be allowed to re-emerge. And in order to do this, you need to do two things. First, divide the region into artificial states. Today we have 22 of them in the region, 22 silly, stupid, failing Arab states, ruled by spoiled, corrupt dictators, and in between create a military outpost that is part of the West and that is loyal to the West, lives on the West and serves the West. Hence, Israel could never have lasted all this time without the Western backing the Zionists have received and continue to receive, especially today from the United States of America, which inherited the world order that existed at the time and now is the dominant force in the world since the end of the Second World War. So you see, this conflict in Palestine is not religious. It is not because of a hatred of the Jews or because of a conflict between the Muslims and the Jews. It's not communal. It's not that the Jews were living there and suddenly the Arabs or the Muslims became fed up with them and they didn't want them there. It's not a territorial dispute. It is an invasion. That's what it is. Zionists, the founders of the state of Israel, all came from Europe. And then, when they discovered that they didn't have sufficient population, they started encouraging and even plotting against Jewish communities elsewhere in the world to bring them to Palestine. I would strongly recommend the recent book by Avi Shlaim, Professor Avi Shlaim. Some of you probably heard the name, a great professor at Oxford University. He wrote his memoirs. He wrote several books. He and Ilan Pappé are among the most respected historians who wrote brilliantly about these issues. But his memoirs, the title of which is Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. He explains how his own family and his own Jewish community were expelled out of Iraq. Not by the Iraqis, not by the Arabs, not by the Muslims, not by the Christians of Iraq, but because of a conspiracy hatched against them by the Mossad, who threw bombs at Jewish synagogues and distributed leaflets ostensibly signed by Arab nationalists threatening the Jews if they didn't leave Iraq. Leave Iraq where to? There was only one way. To Palestine. Because this newly born Zionist state needed a population. You cannot exist without a population. They did the same thing with the Yemeni Jews. They did the same thing with the Moroccan Jews, Tunisian Jews, Libyan Jews, Egyptian Jews. It did not achieve military success, but it was a turning point, a major turning point, a watershed in the history of the struggle in Vietnam. It led to the American student uprising, then to the French student uprising. The laborers then joined the students, and this is what ended with the withdrawal, the humiliating withdrawal of the Americans from Vietnam. And that's why on the 7th of October, I remember on that very same day, I read two articles written by American historians. Both say that as the Tet Offensive led to the end of American colonialism of Vietnam, the 7th of October is likely to end in the liberation of Palestine. And this is no longer a dream. This is a reality that we see happen just before our eyes. The sacrifices made the people of Gaza are changing people's perception about the Palestinians and are encouraging people to go and read more, as I said, and enlighten themselves about the history of this struggle. There were projects before that came to an end. So why shouldn't this come to an end? Just as apartheid in South Africa came to an end, Zionism in Palestine will come to an end. You must have read something about apartheid. I mean, for me, I lived through the years of the struggle against apartheid, and I remember it very well. And I keep citing it as an example to my audiences, because apartheid was a regime in South Africa that divided the population of South Africa according to the color of skin. So there were the whites, who were the masters, a very small minority of people who had white skin, they were the masters, followed by the Indians, who acted like a bridge between the masters and the rest of the population, followed by the colored, who were either of other ethnicities or of mixed marriages, followed by the fourth largest group in the country, the blacks, who are the indigenous population, who are the original owners of the land and who were treated as slaves. And guess what? Leaders, world leaders like Reagan in America, like Margaret Thatcher in Britain, supported apartheid, supported racism in South Africa. Margaret Thatcher pronounced Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist who would never be allowed to set foot on this country's soil. What happened later on? The people of South Africa won the battle. Apartheid came to an end, and Nelson Mandela arrived in this country as a hero, as a great man. The same thing will happen to the Palestinians. Look at what happened in Algeria. The French occupied Algeria for 132 years. How many people did the French killed as a result of their brutal, savage colonialism? 15 million Algerians. 2 million in the last 5 years. Imagine. And then what happened? The Algerians won their country back and kicked the French out. So it's there in history. You just read them. That's why I never lose hope about Palestine. Even though my heart breaks and I bleed for what I see in Gaza, the murdering, the butchering of children, of women, of men, the destruction of life, I see in that a sign of desperation on the part of the colonial powers. And as historians tell us, it's always been the rule. Toward the end of a colonial era, the colonial authorities become much more savage, much more brutal. And this is what we see the Zionists doing in Palestine. So bless you, bless your efforts, keep up the struggle for justice. You are not only just struggling or resisting or putting on this show because of your solidarity with the Palestinians. I think many young men and women around the world today are struggling for a change in the world order. A world order that has proven to be so hypocritical, so racist, that it has to change if our humanity is to live in peace. Thank you very much.
Barakallahu feek. Jazakallah khair for that. If you don't mind, so we're going to do a Q&A inshallah. Okay. So anyone from the audience, if you want to put your hand up and ask a question to the doctor, and then inshallah he'll answer. Anyone just put your hand up if you have a question or anything about himself, his experience, or just anything like that.
Which one?
Yeah, he's asking about the book that you mentioned. I think it was the
memoirs. Yeah, it's the book written by Avi Shleim. The title is 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. And why he calls it 3 worlds? Because he lived in Iraq, that's one world. He lived in occupied Palestine, that's another world. And then he lives now in Britain, that's the 3rd world. And it was his student years in Britain as a young man that changed his perception of the world and encouraged him to study deeper the history of Palestine and the history of his own community. So it's Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew by Avi Shleim. I would recommend also some very, if you like, those of you who would like to take notes, some very useful books in this regard. There's a book by Michael Pryor, P-R-I-O-R. It's called The Bible and Colonialism, and in which he shows how throughout history religion is abused in order to justify attacks on other nations. And he studies in detail three models or three examples. The example of what the white men of Europe did to what is today the Americas, when they said they discovered the New World and almost wiped out the indigenous population. So that's the first example. The second example is the apartheid regime in South Africa and how religion was used to justify that. And then Zionism in Palestine and how religion is used to justify it. And the interesting thing is that it's the same argument. The argument is that if you believe yourself to be God's chosen people, then you have a license to do whatever you like. You act with impunity. And this is a very dangerous ideology. Because if you are white, you think the blacks don't deserve the dignity and the humanity that you have. If you happen to be of a certain religious affiliation, you think people of other religious affiliations don't deserve the same sort of respect or attention, not only from you, but from God. They blame it on God. And by the way, this is a very dangerous trend, because some Muslims even do that, which is of course haram. It's a kabira, it's a major sin. That if you do something wrong to somebody, and then at night you want to go to bed and sleep comfortably, you cannot sleep comfortably until you blame what you did on somebody else. And who better to blame it on than God? You just say, oh, God gave me a license to do it. You just blame it on God. And humanity, the attitude of humans who blame it on God is a very dangerous attitude, because as you see these so-called religious Zionists, a new breed of Zionists led by the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich in the settlements in the West Bank, they believe that God told them to kill, to butcher, to rape, to steal, to dispossess. Anything they do to the other is okay because they have a license from God. And by the way, today, if anybody claims this anywhere in the world, how would they be treated? They would be treated as mad or as criminal, except in the case of Israel. Many Israelis believe this. They get away with it because in America and in the West, many people, or many governments in particular, and they try to force this on the people, associate criticism of ill-doing on the part of Israelis with anti-Semitism, and they seek to silence people. But I think the world now is no longer accepting this. There is no silence anymore, and evidently your movement and this student movement extending from North America to the rest of the globe is testimony. I've just come back from South Korea in Seoul, and I went to 2 universities there, and it's just the same as here. They have an encampment in their own way, and they invite speakers, and they invited me because I was visiting them to speak about Palestine, and they have one slogan, or let's say 2 slogans: free, free Palestine. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Koreans, they know very little English, but they know this slogan very well, and they keep repeating it. Muslim who are what?
Muslim students or Muslim research organizations.
Yeah, well, I think Muslims in particular should be spearheading this activism everywhere in the world, because more than anybody else, Muslims are directly connected to the Palestinian cause. First of all, Palestine is a home of the first Qibla of the Muslims, the third holiest mosque on earth. And not only that, the Zionist project actually was not targeting my mother or my father. The Zionist project was targeting the Ummah as a whole, as I tried to explain to you briefly, that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the last existing Islamic political order, the Western powers that won the war, the First World War, wanted to make sure that that order would never be repeated or re-established. So it is an issue for the Muslims. Palestine is an issue for. I know, of course, that at the passionate level, at the moral level, probably most Muslims do associate with Palestine. But that is not enough. We need to be involved. I mean, today you have Jewish students everywhere dissociating themselves from Zionism, protesting against what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. You find Christian students, you find atheists, you find all sorts of people. Muslims should never be behind all of these. They should be in the forefront, leading that activism. Also because it is in our religion that we stand by justice. We stand by truth and justice. If I see an injustice perpetrated against any human being, irrespective of their religion or their ethnicity or their race, I must support the oppressed. This is my duty as a Muslim. وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتُ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. This is the main characteristic of believing men and women, in that they enjoin the good and forbid the evil. There's so much evil in the world today. Where are the Muslims to forbid that evil and to fight that evil? The evil that America is doing to the world everywhere. You know, when I went to Korea, I was really shocked. Hundreds of American bases in Korea. There are today 65 American bases across the Arab world. There are American bases across Europe. Why? In order for American imperialism to remain alive despite what the people of the world want. Well, the people of the world are not against anything American apart from the arrogance of America. We want to be equal. We want to be free. We want to have the same sort of dignity as human beings. American imperialism is based on racism. They believe they can do to the world whatever they want. And I think the Muslims should be at the forefront with everybody else to resist this and to struggle for a world order that is based on justice, equality, and human dignity.
A tactic that's usually used is decentralization. Decentralization. So they'll let sort of atrocities happen over and over the years and hope that people will kind of lose interest. And I think perhaps not in other countries, but perhaps here in the UK and so on, some people are losing energy. I guess what would you suggest to people that are perhaps losing hope, losing energy to continue what they're doing?
Well, if some people lose energy, others will not lose energy. Others will still be energetic about this. But I think we need to remember that unless we side by the oppressed, we are likely to become the oppressed one day. This is the story of humanity. When a certain segment of humanity has the power to step on another segment, to oppress it, to persecute it, to enslave it, they would not hesitate to do this. If you don't have the morality, and if you don't have the deterrence, this is what will happen. And I think probably This is the time when an increasing number of people around the world are feeling more united than ever before. We feel all threatened by the evil that is perpetrated by these imperialists, represented in the Middle East by the Zionists. You know, if someone like Biden claims that the Israelis, despite having committed all these crimes, are just defending themselves. And he is the president of the strongest country in the world. And he has at his disposal all sorts of weaponry. And he sends that weaponry to the Israelis. What would prevent a president like that from doing something similar to somebody else? By the way, I was intrigued the other day by a tweet by someone who was enumerating some of the movies that talk about themes of this sort, like the Hunger Games, for instance. I only recently watched the last part. I thought, oh, I should have watched this a long time ago. And recently, flying back from Korea, 12 and a half hours to Frankfurt. So I watched Napoleon. I don't know if any of you watched Napoleon, a new movie. It's fascinating that this is the story that keeps happening. It keeps happening. Are we going to wait until it happens to us? Or are we going to immunize ourselves by resisting that tyranny and standing by its victims? The choice is ours. Yes.
I had a question. There's mosques in Birmingham and nationwide. Mosques in Birmingham, Green Lane Mosque and Amana it's called. They are normalizing Zionism. They have invited Zionists, hosted iftars with them, and when we question them, they are so ferocious with the dialogue, even like being so abusive and physically assaulting people as well. What would you say to Muslims and people who are in charge of mosques, normalizing Zionism and inviting Zionists to break bread or have iftar with them? I mean, it's just barbaric, and even speaking about it, it just makes me so angry. What would you say, Dr. Tamimi, about?
Well, I just would say to them, shame on you. Shame on them who do this. The Zionists are racists. Even if the Zionists were not having this problem in Palestine, in a Muslim country, even if they were having it against anybody in the world, that racism demands from us that we stand against it, rather than go to bed with it. So shame on any Muslim who normalizes with Zionism. And of course, today, most of the Arab leaders are Zionists. I mean, they have Arab names, they speak Arabic, they probably go to the mosque on Friday, but actually they go to bed with the Zionists. So they are as Zionists, if not worse even. So Zionism is an ideology. And there are many Jews today who are fighting against Zionism. So Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing. And we should never equate them. To the contrary, I think the struggle of the Jewish people today is to free themselves from the shackles imposed on them by Zionism. Yes, sister?
With your extensive history in activism, do you have any, or what is one way we can overcome intimidation as students in an encampment? If you have anything to.
Well, you have to be patient first. You know the story of prophets and messengers and reformists across history. They are bullied, they are intimidated, obstacles are created in their way. You have to be patient and you have to continue the struggle. And eventually truth and justice prevail. We may not see the results with our own eyes. It doesn't matter. I don't struggle in order to see Palestine liberated in my life, but to see it liberated, it doesn't matter when. That's the issue. If you play your part in fighting evil, then you've done your job. The dangerous thing is to give up and become desperate and lose hope. That's very dangerous. It's dangerous to oneself because we lose. If I give up, I lose. There will be somebody else taking over. You see, the struggle between good and evil is continuous. It doesn't stop. It's unending. It's just that God honors those who decide to fight evil. So if you want to be among the honored ones, you need to have the patience and the steadfastness and to continue. And look at the people of Gaza. I mean, what more can happen to them or to anybody else than what we see happening to them? Yet, they are not giving up. They are not surrendering. And they have faith in their cause. What we need to do is to have faith in the cause we're having. And as I said earlier, don't be dismayed if you don't see the results in your lifetime. My grandfather was in the resistance against British colonialism. My father was in the resistance against Zionism. I have been active for Palestine throughout my life. And I prepare my children and grandchildren to do the same. What matters is for this process to continue. We are not the only people. I mean, the people of South Africa who struggled against apartheid. How many gave their lives before they saw their people free? The people of Algeria. How many of them gave their lives for the cause before Algeria was liberated? And this applies to Afghanistan, applies to Iraq, applies to Latin America, all parts of the world. It's just the same story. It will be a great honor to be on the side of truth and justice.
Some questions here that I didn't want to ask out loud. The first one is, what is the next step after the encampment, and what should the encampment do next?
Well, did you ask me when you started the encampment? It's your business. You decide. You look around and see what's happening. But I cannot tell you what is it you need to do, apart from urging you to learn more about the history of this cause. It will give you more ability to sustain your struggle if you really know the truth. Perhaps it's a good idea also to link up with others, whether in America or in Africa or in Asia or here in Europe. We need to, for this probably to become a global movement against Zionism. Just like in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s, there was a global movement against apartheid, a global movement against Zionism. And the young people of today are the ones who are going to make a difference. That's why decision makers in various Western capitals are horrified. They're terrified. They see these young men and women on university campuses challenging them, and then they think to themselves, well, in a few years' time, these are going to be the leaders. These are going to be the decision makers. So probably today, you are active in this encampment here. In a few years' time, you will be somewhere in one of the important departments of government, or I don't know where, maybe this in a decision-making capacity. It is going to happen. I'll just tell you a story about this. A former government minister in this country once invited me and a group of people to meet him in his office. And I reminded him that he was one of the students in the 70s taking part in the sit-in Trafalgar Square opposite to the South African embassy protesting against apartheid. And you see, later on he became a Secretary of State in this country. And I said to him, if you were so passionate about supporting the struggle against apartheid, why aren't you as passionate in supporting the Palestinian people? And he laughed and he said, you've really asked about something big. But anyway, he knows. He was a young man protesting against apartheid. A few years later, he became a Secretary of State in this government. The students in Columbia, in other American universities, in Birmingham and other British universities, in European universities around the world, these are this is the generation that very soon will be in the decision-making seats around the world.
Another question is, what does a liberated Palestine look like, and what do you think of the two states?
Well, let's elaborate it first, and then we will. But forget about the two-state solution. The two-state solution is a silly idea. The whole purpose of it was to preserve Zionism. So by creating another useless, failing Arab state called Palestine, next to a Zionist state that has hegemony and domination, that this would be a good solution. It was tried. Yasser Arafat went to Oslo. He signed a deal with the Israelis, and that was supposed to deliver in 5 years' time, by 1998, a Palestinian state. And rather than deliver a Palestinian state, we have no more Palestinian land left today. So there's only one solution to the Palestinian problem, and that's the end of Zionism. When Zionism is no more, we can sit and talk. Muslims, Christians, and Jews can live in peace again as they did for centuries before. And this is what happened to Nelson Mandela. They went to his prison cell when he was in Robben Island, and they said to him, come on, Nelson, we want to put an end to this violence, because there was resistance, there was violent resistance. And it is a legitimate right to resist foreign occupation. It's not terrorism. Terrorism is invasion. Terrorism is occupation. Resistance is a legitimate act. They said to him, how can we stop this problem? He said to them, very easy. Just end apartheid. No more apartheid. And then we can talk. They laughed at him and left him, but then they came back again and they agreed that apartheid was the problem. Zionism today is the problem, and Zionism must come to an end.
Last question, inshallah. The question is, what reasons do you think a university, like this one for example, has that makes it so reluctant to divest from Israel, even though it's obvious that we're doing that stuff?
Yeah, because universities are part of this world order that we live under, and it was acceptable to invest in a regime like Israel because Israel is considered to be okay for them. But I think the future generation of university authorities around the world will have a different opinion, because now they know what Israel is about. Israel is a colonial outpost. And if you have respect for humanity, if you have respect for yourself, you don't invest in a colonial outpost. Zionism has been proven to be so ugly that this ugliness infects whoever supports it or invests in it. And I think your movement is the beginning of that change. Hopefully one day we will see an end to all such investments.
Jazakallah khair. That'll be the end of the Q&A, inshallah. But would like to, would also like to thank you yourself.
Jazakallah khair. Thank
for your
you.
time. I'm sure everybody has learnt a lot, and also from your perspective, it was very informative. So Jazakallah khair.